Hello, early folks. Welcome. Let's see, looks like we got 4 people in here so far. Wow, 5. Hi, everybody. I am going to wait just a few minutes to start so that everyone has the chance to join in. So feel free to type and introduce yourselves in the live window there, and we'll get started in just a minute. Oh, hey, Kevin. And if you have any technical problems, if you have trouble seeing or hearing or anything like that, just message Leah or Liv in the chat. What time is it where all of you are? It's, let's see, 11 in the morning here in Portland, Oregon. Is it nighttime for you? Hello, hello to Nigeria. Okay. Oh, wow, 32 people already. All right, Leah and Olivia, who just typed, are the people you should message if you have problems. They are our co-organizers at the Language Documentation Training Center. So they can help you out while I'm talking. Oh, well, okay. A lot of people where it's afternoon or evening right now. And I think in the Philippines, it's about 2 a.m. So if anyone from the Philippines joins, I'm very impressed with your dedication. Yes, absolutely. Kudos to everybody who's joining in the middle of the night right now. Thank you for coming. And if you just joined, welcome. I'm going to wait a couple more minutes to make sure everybody is able to join the live stream before we get started. Oh, wow, 12:30 in India. Thank you for coming. Wow, Jessley, 3 a.m. Thanks for being here. Okay, I think I will wait 2 more minutes before we get started. So feel free to introduce yourselves and say hi and chat. Get a cup of coffee or some water or whatever you need for this webinar. And in case you haven't found it, these slides right here are available in the Facebook group. You will find a link so that you can look at the slides too, and you can look at them later if you want to save them. Okay, I think we're going to get started. It's 11:06, so I'm going to go ahead and start. But don't worry, if you miss anything and you have questions, you can ask at the end and we'll go back and answer, yeah? So let me introduce myself, everybody. I'm so happy that you're here joining us for this webinar. My name is Anna Ballou, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Endangered Languages Project. And I am also a PhD student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where the Language Documentation Training Center is. And so I'm very happy to welcome you here, along with Leah Pappas and Liv Bianchini, who are representing the Language Documentation Training Center. And I am very excited to talk to you all about language documentation. So this is the first week of an 8-week webinar. And so every Saturday at this time, a different person will talk to you about a different topic in language documentation. So this week, we're going to get started with a general overview of language endangerment and language diversity and language documentation, what it is and why we do it. And I know that I have a strong American accent, and sometimes I talk very fast. So I will try to go slowly and speak understandably. But if you have any trouble understanding me, just let me know. I will slow down. Okay, so to get started, just some administrative things. So if you haven't filled out the Google form yet to sign up, please do. That will help us a lot. It will help us pair you with a mentor or a speaker. And yes, some people have asked, at the end of the webinar, we will be handing out digital certificates of attendance. So you will get a certificate that says you attended this webinar. And if you are a speaker of an endangered or indigenous or underdocumented language, and you want a linguist mentor to help you with your documentation project, please contact me. If you just signed up this morning and you don't have a mentor yet, don't worry, we are still working to find you a mentor. Just be a little bit patient and we will do it soon. Okay, hi everybody who just joined. Thanks for coming. I hope it's not 3 in the morning for you. So let's continue with some technical stuff. This session is live right now. So you are here watching me, but if you couldn't make it to this session, or if you can't make it to any sessions in the future because it's 3 a.m. or you're busy, whatever, no problem, that's fine. You can watch any of these videos anytime after they're recorded. Just go to the Facebook group and you will find all of these videos, okay? And also, you should know that you will experience some lag, which means I'm talking and you won't hear me talking until about 16 seconds later, or maybe more, maybe a couple of minutes later. So if you type something and I don't answer right away, don't worry, I'm not ignoring you. It just takes a little bit of time for the video to catch up with the chat. So just be patient. And if you have any technical problems, if you can't see, you can't hear, whatever, contact Leah Pappas or Liv Bianchini in the chat and they can help you out. So let's get really started. How many languages do you think exist in the world today? Linguists, don't answer. Let's just have some guesses. How many languages do you think there are? I'm going to take guesses. Let's see how long it takes for y'all to type. 6,000, that's a good guess. 7,000, an excellent guess. You guys clearly know the answer here. You're already experts. Okay, yes. Paula, Momin, Joshua, you were close. Osiris, extremely close. There are about 7,000 languages in the world today. Of course, that number is really difficult to count. It's hard to get an exact number of languages for a lot of different reasons. But the best guess we have is about 7,000, and that comes from a database called the Ethnologue. But we also know that of all of these 7,000 languages in the world, most of them are spoken by very small populations. So about 96% of the world's languages, right? The vast majority of the world's languages are spoken by about 4% of people. And 4% of all of the world's languages, so the big languages like English and Arabic and Mandarin and Spanish, those are spoken by 96% of the people in the world. So there's a big difference between how many languages there are and how many people speak most of these languages, yeah? All right. But what is endangered when we talk about languages? We have thousands of languages in the world, but usually we talk about endangered species, right? When you hear endangered, you probably think of maybe a tiger or a frog or a rare bird. But actually, just like biological creatures, languages can become endangered too. And what does that mean? Well, endangered basically means that the language is at risk of not being spoken anymore, right? When we talk about an endangered species, it means that there is a risk that that species will disappear, that there will be no more tigers or no more eagles. Same thing with languages. If a language is endangered, there is a risk that there will be no more speakers of that language. And we know that this happens, right? Just like species go extinct, a lot of languages have fallen silent and lost all of their speakers just within the last 60 years. Hundreds and hundreds of languages have fallen silent in the very recent past. And endangerment is now happening faster than at any point that we know of in human history. And there's a lot you can read about why that is, but the problem is more serious now than at any time in the past that we know of. And actually, right now, about 46% of all of the languages in the world, that's almost half of all of the world's languages, are currently endangered. That means there's a risk that they won't be spoken anymore soon. The catalog of endangered languages, which is from the University of Hawaii mostly, is where we get this information. And you can visit the catalog at endangeredlanguages.com if you're curious. There is also a link here to a book chapter that explains this number a little bit better if you are interested in the linguistic details. So, why do languages become endangered? Does it just happen? Is it magic? No, there are a lot of different causes of language endangerment. And they're very complicated, but I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the main things that cause language endangerment in a lot of situations. So first of all, there are the big, really bad things that cause language endangerment. Things like colonization, overt oppression of people, even genocide, war. The really big, terrible things can cause language endangerment. And in situations like North America and Australia and many other parts of the world, language endangerment is a pretty direct result of forces like this. Really bad stuff where a lot of people died or were forced out of their lands or otherwise colonized. But that's not always the case. A lot of cases of language endangerment happen for other reasons. What are those other reasons? A lot of the time it's also about economic pressure, right? So maybe in order to get a good job, people feel like they have to learn a dominant language and use that dominant language. Sometimes people have to move to big cities where there aren't other speakers of their language, and so they have to speak another language. Or maybe something is causing it to be impossible for people to stay in their traditional lands and live the way they used to. And again, that can be a big factor in what causes languages to become endangered. Not always economic pressures, but in most cases of language endangerment, you will probably find some economic factors. Another big set of things that can cause language endangerment are political and legal factors, right? So things like language policy, laws about what languages you can use in what situations. Maybe there's not enough funding to preserve a language or give it the infrastructure it needs. So for example, maybe there is not enough government funding to have a school in this language. Maybe it's actually illegal to speak this language in schools. Or maybe It's not illegal and there's a little bit of funding, but it's not politically very safe to speak that language. There are a lot of different factors that can contribute, and it's different in every case. Sometimes people also think that it's big languages that kill small languages. Sometimes they talk about killer languages like English, right? There's this idea that languages are like fish. The big ones will eat the smaller ones, and the smaller ones will eat the smallest ones. And sometimes it kind of does work like that. Sometimes a really, really big language will start taking over medium-sized languages, and medium-sized languages will start taking over very small languages. Obviously, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes people just shift to a language that's about the same size, but for example, in a place like Kenya, you might find some communities where a small language like Ogiek is shifting to a medium-sized language like Kikuyu, and even Kikuyu speakers are shifting to a big language like Swahili. Sometimes you get a chain effect like that. Sometimes people just shift to one major language like English or Mandarin or Arabic. Again, it differs from situation to situation. And another big thing that can cause language endangerment are things we call sociolinguistic factors, attitudes, the way people feel about their languages and think about their languages, and what the sort of social meanings of each language are. So, for example, I work in southern Cameroon, and I study a language called Iasa. And in the Iasa community, sometimes young parents will say things to me like, I want to speak only French to my children, because that way my children can get good jobs in society, and they won't be just stuck with our language. So there's an attitude that French is more valuable economically, it's more valuable politically, and there's also an attitude that says, if you speak your own indigenous language, you might be worse at French. Now, that's not necessarily true. It's often not true at all. But we will talk about multilingualism and the complications of learning many different languages in a later session. For now, let's all agree that you do not have to give up your own language in order to be good at another language, yeah? So attitude factors can be a really big contributor to language endangerment. And in most cases, it's not just one thing that causes language endangerment. Usually, it's a lot of different factors coming together, because economic things are not unrelated to political things. Political things are not unrelated to histories of colonization or genocide or oppression. And all of that is very closely related to how people feel about their language, what they think about their language, and the decisions they make as far as language use. It all comes together and it's all related. So usually you're going to find that language endangerment is very complicated for each different language. But it's important to remember that all of the factors which cause language endangerment have nothing to do with the language itself. Or as Morris Swadesh said in 1948 in one of the very first papers on language loss, the factors determining obsolescence of language are non-linguistic. That's kind of technical language. What does that mean? It means that languages do not become endangered for reasons like, oh, my language is too complicated, or the opposite, my language is too simple. That's not a reason languages become endangered. It's not because they're too hard to learn. Humans are amazing. A human baby can learn any language, no problem. So all languages are equally feasible for a baby to learn. Kids can learn any language. It's not that they're too hard. It's also not true that some languages are more logical. Sometimes people will say, oh, this language is more rational than the other, and that's why this language is winning. That's not true. From a linguistic perspective, from the standpoint of scientific study of language, all languages are equally flexible, useful for communication, and beautiful to a linguist, right? You might think that your language is the most beautiful one in the world, and it is to you, but no language is objectively prettier or better or more logical than another one. And similarly, no language is not fit for the modern world. Every language is constantly developing new words for new concepts. Just because your language does not yet have a word for Facebook or cell phone doesn't mean that it's not fit to use in the modern world. It just means, like English, like Spanish, like Arabic, your language will invent a new word for new stuff. So every language is perfectly usable for every reason as long as you can develop words and structures to talk about it. So basically, there's nothing related to a language itself that causes it to become endangered. It's never about the words or the grammar or the sounds in the language. It's always about stuff outside the language, related to society and the people who speak it and the people around them. Language endangerment is a social issue, not a linguistic issue. And there's a lovely quote from Jane Hill. It's long. You can read it on your own, but there is a link to this paper here in the bottom if you'd like to read a very thoughtful paper about the ways we talk about language endangerment and the reasons behind it. So why does it matter? Who cares about language endangerment? Is it important if half of the world's languages stop being spoken? Well, hopefully, because you are in this webinar, we all already agree that Indigenous and endangered and underdocumented languages matter. It's the International Year of Indigenous Languages. The UN agrees that languages matter. So let's all understand that language really matters a lot for cultural identity, personal identity, spiritual identity, things like self-determination, sovereignty, autonomy. Social structure is closely related to language, and language encodes a lot of very important information too about the natural world, about human nature, about what we think about and talk about and dream about. And for linguists, language diversity matters very much because without all of the world's languages, we can never really understand how human language works. Any theory about language that's just based on English, French, and Japanese is not going to be a very good theory for linguistics. So essentially, we're not here to argue about whether or not languages matter. They matter, we all agree. But if you have questions about the specifics, about, for example, ecological knowledge or cultural identity, you should discuss it with everyone else in the group in a respectful way. Be respectful. So let's talk a little bit more about endangered languages and how we identify them. What does it mean for a language to be endangered? Well, there isn't any way to know for sure what will happen to a language in the future, right? We are not psychics, we are not magicians, we cannot see the future, but we can make some rough predictions and we can assess levels of language endangerment based on things like, most importantly, are children learning this language? So if a language has 1 million speakers, you might think, okay, it's safe. But if you then learn that all of those 1 million speakers are over the age of 40, that's not a good sign, right? Because then in 40 or 50 years, all of those speakers will be very old or they will have passed away. And there won't be any more speakers, even if just 1 or 2 generations ago, there were 1 million speakers. For that reason, whether or not there are children learning the language is maybe the most important factor in determining whether a language is endangered. Similarly, how many speakers are there total is another rough way to look at whether a language is endangered. But keep in mind that very small languages can be strong and very big languages can be endangered, right? Like I said, if you have 1 million speakers but no children, that's bad. If you have only maybe 100 speakers, but all of the children in your community speak that language, it might be less endangered than you think. And so another thing we look at is whether that number of speakers is changing. Are there more speakers than there used to be? Are there fewer speakers than there used to be? How fast is that number changing? Has the number of speakers doubled recently? Has it been cut in half? So we look at how fast the number of speakers is changing. We also think about the ways people use the language. Do they use it in most parts of their life? Do they use it in many areas of an average day? Or do they just use it in a very few specific ways? One of the things that often happens in language endangerment situations is that the language will start being used for fewer and fewer things. So maybe for your mother, the language was for talking to friends and going to the market and going to church and cooking and traveling to see her relatives. But now, for you, the language is only for cooking and talking to your relatives, right? Nobody uses the language in the market anymore. They don't use it at school anymore. We would say that the domains of use for that language are shrinking, and that is a bad sign for language endangerment. We also look at whether there are big social factors affecting the use of this language. So for example, is there a law against using this language, right? Has it been made illegal to use this language in the government, in schools, or other situations? Are there bad attitudes towards this language? Do people not want to speak this language anymore? Are they ashamed? Are they proud of the language, right? Are there big environmental changes happening that might affect the language? So for example, if all of the speakers of a language live on a small island, and that island is beginning to flood because of rising sea levels, that language may be affected if everyone has to leave the island. Similarly, if there is a war where that language is spoken, if there are political troubles, whatever, if something is affecting the safety and stability of the community who speaks the language, that is an endangerment factor too. So if you're curious about the technical linguistic details of how language endangerment levels are assessed, there is a link to an article here by Nala Lee and John Van Wey about the Language Endangerment Index, which is the scale we use for the Endangered Languages Project and the Catalog of Endangered Languages. There are other ways to measure language endangerment, and you can read about them in that article. And it's free, so go read it for free. So I bet a lot of you are currently wondering whether your own language is endangered, and that's an important question. Because before you can start treating a problem, you have to give a good diagnosis. You have to know what the degree of endangerment is and what's causing it, so that we can think about ways to make your language stronger. So to start off, you can visit endangeredlanguages.com and search for your language to see what it says. So, for example, if you go to endangeredlanguages.com, and you type in the name of the language you are searching for. So for me, I'm going to look at IASA. And you can click right here to go to the page for that language. And if you scroll down, you will see a level of endangerment. And the color on this box also matches the level of endangerment. So you will see something that says threatened. IASA is assessed as threatened, which is kind of the middle level of language endangerment. You can do that same thing if you're curious about the level of endangerment of your language. Or if you do not speak an endangered language or a language you suspect is endangered, you can look at all of the languages spoken near you. So if you go to the map here, you can click to see. Sorry, it is not loading for me. Let me reload it. If you click the map, you can explore near where you live. So I live in Portland, Oregon, Oh, sorry, my internet is very slow right now because I am streaming to you. But eventually the map will load. Come on, map, there we go. So you can scroll around to look at where you live. I live in Portland, Oregon, right up here. So I can go and look at all of these languages near me, which are endangered or even dormant. And dormant means that they don't have any fluent speakers anymore, but they could still be brought back. They could be awakened. So scroll around and look on the map at what's near you. You can also click here, languages, to look at a list of countries if you are interested in what endangered languages are spoken in the country where you live. So if you want to look at the United States, you can just click USA and see information about 165 endangered languages in the US. So there's an exercise at the end that you can do to share information about the languages near you or the status of your language. So we'll come back to that. But let's think about what we can do about this problem of language endangerment. Well, we're all here to learn about language documentation. And that is one of the things that we can start out by doing to support endangered languages. So language documentation basically means creating a lasting, multi-purpose record of a language. What does that mean? What is lasting and what is multi-purpose? Well, we want the records we make to be available in the future, right? We don't want to make a recording and then throw it in the garbage so that no one can listen to it. No, we want people to be able to listen and learn from the things we record. We'll talk about restrictions on that, but generally, we want these records to be lasting. We also want it to be multi-purpose, and that's a little bit more complicated, but it means we want these things to be good for linguistic analysis. We want these materials to be useful for language revitalization, if that happens later. We want these things to be useful for sharing information about the culture, if that's something that people want to do, right? We want the recordings we make to be useful for lots of different things. So to do this, overall, we make recordings of different aspects of a language. So not only how it sounds and how the grammar works, but also what is a normal way to talk? How do you have a conversation? How do you tell a story? How do you sing in this language? How do you tell a joke? What do people say to each other when they're meeting for the first time? All of that stuff is part of what we document. We also try to use professional or good quality recording equipment if possible. So obviously, not all of you will have access to a fancy audio recorder or an expensive video camera, but I think a lot of you might have access to cell phones. So later on, we're going to learn about how to make good quality recordings, or the best quality possible, with whatever is available to you where you are. And like I said, we keep our language data in an archive so that even a long time in the future, people can access it and learn from it, if that's appropriate. But in theory, we want this information to be available to our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, generations and generations, who will be able to learn about and understand and hear these languages. And finally, if we're interested in linguistics, we can also study the language, the structure of the language, its sounds, its grammar, its sociolinguistics, all of the different parts of the language. Oh, I see a question. I'm going to take questions at the end just so that everybody has a chance to catch up, and I'll answer all at once. So Ilum, just save that one and I will answer it at the end. So why do we do language documentation? What's the point? Is it just about generating a bunch of CDs that sit on a shelf and get dusty? No, it's for a purpose. And one of the most important purposes of language documentation is that if we have a good record of a language, it can be revitalized, it can be strengthened, it can be brought back into more use by more people more often. So revitalize just means to bring back to life, to give more life again. And documentation is an important first step towards that. Imagine that your language has 100 speakers today, and you are worried because most of them are very old, and you're worried that your grandchildren will not have the chance to hear and learn from these speakers. So, if you create good recordings and good records of your language, you will then be able to, very far in the future, start bringing it back to life and back into use. So here we see documentation of Lenape in the 1970s. This was 40 years ago this work began. But now this documentation and these records are being used to revitalize the language, right? Children are learning, they're learning to speak, they're learning to use it in everyday life. And so this is the progress we hope to make from documentation to revitalization. Eventually, it's a long road. So what do we document in a very general sense? Well, the basic stuff that most people start with are lists of words and sentences. This helps us figure out how the language sounds and how the grammar works and how to say things. So when you think of dictionaries and grammars, that is very basic documentation that a lot of people start with. But that's not the end of it. We also want to document stories, songs, poems, recipes, ways to make fishing nets, your aunt's favorite joke, anything, directions to the store, any way that people use language is worth documenting. So basically the answer is anything and everything that you find important about your language and culture, and anything that you want to share and save for the future is something that's worth documenting. So if you really love music, you can work on documenting songs. If you are really into fishing, you can document ways to catch specific fish. If you love games, you can document your favorite jokes and word puzzles and riddles. Whatever you want, we're very open to your ideas. And language documentation is really about what you find important and what is important to your culture and community. So, important note, we do not document things that are not okay to document. This should be obvious, but some things are not for sharing with outsiders. Some things are meant to be kept secret. Some things have cultural protocols that mean you shouldn't record them, you shouldn't share that information, you shouldn't maybe even ask about it. So you need to be very careful and very respectful of the folks you are working with. Always respect their preferences on what can be recorded and what can be shared. So there are a few links here to articles and chapters you can read, and there are many, many wonderful writings out there about what it means to do language documentation in an ethical way. If you have links that you love, if there are articles that you think are very good about this, share them. We want to see them. So when we talk about language documentation, is it only for languages which are endangered? Is it only for languages which you find in the catalog of endangered languages? No, of course not. A lot of languages are not very well documented, even if they are strong and not endangered. So even if children are learning your language and people use it all day in their life, it may still need documentation, and we're glad you're here to learn how. So is your language underdocumented? Well, if you don't speak English, Mandarin, Arabic, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, or Korean, sort of the giant languages, then it is very possible that your language is underdocumented. So are there a lot of books written about the vocabulary and grammar of your language? Is there a lot of media in your language? Can you watch movies? Can you use Facebook or Google in your language? Or is there a lot of information about your language out there? Are there Wikipedia articles, right? It's stuff like this that doesn't necessarily relate to endangerment, but relates to what is available in your language, where documentation can help. So we're getting close to noon, and I want to open it up to questions, but here are some exercises you can do this week if you want to explore these concepts. And you can share your answers in the Facebook group with your partner or both. So first, Is your language currently endangered? Is it in the catalog of endangered languages? Do you feel that it is endangered? If it is in the catalog of endangered languages, what is its rating? Is it at risk? Is it critically endangered? Is it somewhere in the middle? And if you're not a speaker of an endangered or minority language, what languages are endangered near where you live? What is your relationship to those languages in your context? And if your language is endangered, why do you think that is? What is making it become endangered? What are some factors affecting the vitality of your language? What do you think? And what does the internet say? And also, how do you and the people in your community feel about your language? What are the attitudes towards your language? Do some people think it's old-fashioned? Do people think it's the best marker of your identity? Do people really love your language? Do they kind of not care? In most communities, you will find different opinions. Usually, some people will care very much, some people won't care. Think about what it is like in your community and how people feel about your language. And also think about why your language matters to you, right? I know we said we will all agree that languages matter. They do, but the reasons why they matter is different for different people. So for you, why is your language important? Why do you want to work to strengthen your language? And what do you think is the most important thing to document about your language and your culture? Is there something that you are very interested in sharing with the world? For example, do you love recipes? Do you want to share some of the ways people cook traditional foods in your language? Or jokes, songs, whatever you like? What do you think is the most important stuff to share about your language? And so after those exercises, which are not homework, you don't have to do it, it's totally optional, but if you want to, you can do those exercises. And now I will be happy to answer any questions you have. But do remember, there is a little bit of a delay on the video. So if it takes me a few seconds or even a minute to see your question and answer, just be patient, I'm not ignoring you, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to start reading the questions. Okay, so the question, what if a language is not currently defined in the map on endangeredlanguages.com? Well, it depends on whether you think your language is endangered. If you think it is endangered and it's not on the website, email me. I also work for the Catalog of Endangered Languages, and I will help figure out whether your language should go in the catalog, why or why not. We'll talk about it and work it out. Okay. A question about whether you should document taboo words. That's a tough question. It really depends on your relationship to the language, your relationship to the person who is speaking, and the general community's wishes about what should be shared about the language. So some communities find taboo words just fine, not very offensive, kind of funny. So it's okay to talk about them, it's okay to share them. Some people love dirty jokes or bad words or whatever, and it's not a problem to share that stuff. Other communities, it's a real big problem, and it's not at all okay to include that stuff in published materials. So that's a tough answer. The answer is, it depends on who you're working with and what language. Just be sure to talk about it very transparently and honestly and respectfully with the people you are working with. A comment about Arabic not being well documented because there are many, many varieties. That is totally true. I should have said modern standard Arabic and classical Arabic are pretty well documented, but there are lots and lots of different global Arabic varieties that are not well documented at all. Thank you, Chelsea. And a question about whether stigmatized dialects applies. Yes, that's a great question, because even linguists have a lot of trouble determining what is a dialect and what is a language. Maybe you have heard that old quote that says, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy, right? The line between a language and a dialect sometimes is more political or social than really linguistic. So absolutely, endangered dialects, So for example, some kinds of English or some kinds of Arabic, like I said, can totally be endangered. All right, so a question about recording conversation between two or more fluent or proficient speakers. Yes, that is hugely important, right? Because what is most language use? If we think about it realistically, most languages are used to have conversations most of the time. Sometimes people give speeches, they sing, they pray, but mostly languages are for conversation. And so documenting conversations between two good speakers is one of the best things you can do when you're starting out in documentation. Thank you, Heather. Okay, Lila, what if a language is endangered and its speakers have chosen not to pass it on to their children? Is that such a big problem? Can we as outsiders push a community to use a language? No way. That's a great question. My personal opinion is that language revitalization is always something that happens because people want it and in no other case. And I think most linguists would agree on that. You can't force anyone to keep a language or to revitalize a language, and you shouldn't force them. It has to be something that is chosen by the speakers themselves for themselves. And our job as linguists, I think, is just to help however we can, not to force people or make people do anything. All right. Let's see, how important are linguists in revitalization efforts? Can it be done without a linguist? That is such a great question. The answer is linguists can be helpful, but they are not mandatory. You can definitely do revitalization work without a linguist, but it does depend on the situation of your language. So, for example, if your language has good documentation, but maybe no more speakers, it might be pretty hard for your community to start revitalization on their own. If maybe they have trouble understanding the documentation, if it's very technical, then a linguist could be a big help. But if you still have lots of fluent speakers who can pass on the language, especially to children, then you don't necessarily need a linguist. There's lots of things a community can do on their own if they have the people and the resources and the time and the motivation. And we'll talk about that in a future session, all of the different ways to do language documentation. Let's see, Joshua's question, can you give tips on how to convince strangers to allow their language to be documented? That's a tough question. And my initial response would be, if somebody is not sure that they want their language documented, don't push it at first. People have a lot of good reasons for being private about their language, for not wanting to share. So if someone is reluctant to share their language, for starters, definitely just respect that choice. If someone is not sure, they don't see the value, but they're not opposed to it, then I'll post some good resources about why it's useful to have documentation of a language and how they could benefit from it and why they might want to do it. But don't force anybody, never force anybody. Let's see, what is my opinion on sign languages, asks Bertha. I think they're languages. They're languages like all of the other languages, except that you speak them with gesture instead of your mouth, or rather your vocal folds. So sign languages can definitely be endangered, just like spoken languages, and the processes can be very similar. There are some special considerations for sign languages, and we can talk about that in the Facebook group because it gets kind of complicated. All right, Momin asks, how can we use technology to save our languages? Great question. There are a lot of different technologies that you can use. There are apps for language learning. You can have digital databases like talking dictionaries. You can form Facebook groups to practice the language. There are lots of different options, and a lot of them are free or very cheap. So at a future session on language revitalization, we will talk about technology and applications for language revitalization. All right, so Faith asks, would you have tips for those looking to document a language they haven't quite grasped yet or are alien to? So if you do not speak the language, but you want to start documenting it, that is a great question, and it is something that people spend whole years of training in graduate school to learn how to do. But there are some easier starting points if you don't have time to go get a graduate degree. a good place to start is generally words, right? And we'll post some tips for doing very basic language documentation if you do not speak the language and it's not your heritage language. That's a pretty long answer, so we'll put up a doc with some basic tips, Faith. Okay, Adi asks, what is the possible future development of context-sensitive lexicography for the indigenous languages? Ooh, that is a very specific and very technical question. Adi, I hope you will not be offended if I answer that in the Facebook group instead of right now, because it will be a long answer. Okay, Siam asks, for languages that are not written and don't have any orthography, does the documentation rely only on audio visuals, or should linguists develop a system for writing it? Good question. Orthography, or writing systems, can be one of the hardest and most complicated things to develop for a language. People have fights about writing systems all the time. But the good news is, with technology now, it's easy to get started with just audio and video recordings. Even if there's no way to write the language yet, you don't necessarily need it to get started on documentation. So we'll talk next week about orthography. Peter is going to give a workshop on sounds and writing, and he can answer more detailed questions about writing systems. Okay, so Chelsea asks, elaborate on your comments about speakers' agency in choosing to document their language. Does this imply that linguists should not reach out to endangered language speakers and that the effort should be initiated from within the community? That is such a good question, Chelsea. I'm not saying that. I actually got in touch with the IASA community because I reached out, not because they contacted me. And it's worked out very well so far. I think, is Sammy here? Hi, Sammy, my colleague from the IASA community. Sometimes the outcomes can be wonderful if the linguist initiates contact. I think many linguists dream of being contacted by a community. Some of my friends call that being summoned, right? Many of us dream of being summoned to work on a language, but that's not always possible. Sometimes the linguist has to be the one to reach out, and that can work fine. If it goes well, it goes well. All right, Ashley asks, what would your advice be for a college student looking to get into the field after they graduate? It's hard, but you should do it. I would say consider maybe doing a master's degree just so that you can learn the basics and, more importantly, get mentorship and contacts. Language documentation, like most things, is about relationships. So if you can get involved either through school or through volunteering, or maybe through a local indigenous group or an archive or a library, whoever is doing this work, try and build a relationship and be of service to them. And that's the best advice I can give very briefly. All right, so Lila asks, if you can't document trends that exist within a language and the community uses but won't share, won't that pose a problem when revitalizing the language? Yes. Yes, that is so true. So the way we were talking about, some things should not be documented and cannot be documented because they're private, because people don't want to share. That does mean that if there is revitalization in the future, those things will not necessarily be revitalized if there's no record. If they have not been passed on to the next generation and nobody recorded them, there's not much we can do. All we can do is respect the decision to keep those things private and not pass them on and not share them. And that's true in many communities. People say, okay, we're going to keep parts of our language, but this stuff over here, no, we're not going to share it and we're not going to pass it on. And that's a decision that as outsiders, you just gotta respect. All right, oh, that's all the questions I see. If anybody has other questions, theoretically, this goes for another 5 minutes, but I'm happy to stay longer if you have more questions. And thank you everybody for coming. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about your languages and your thoughts and your ideas in the Facebook group. Okay, I'm just gonna hang out here for a second in case anyone has any other questions. I'm not in a hurry, so questions if you got them, but thank you everybody so much for coming. And I'm really looking forward to the work we're gonna do. A question about language documentation centers in Europe. Europe is not my strong suit. I know there's a lot of great work going on with the Celtic languages in Ireland, in the UK, in France, in the Netherlands. There's also a new center at, I think, the University of Reykjavik in Iceland. I will look up that link and post it. And there are a lot of schools with great language documentation programs in Europe. The University of Leiden, formerly the Max Planck Institutes. I think they still do a lot of language documentation. The University of London, SOAS, Leipzig, many other great schools in Europe. If you have specific questions about European language documentation, post it in the group, and I or someone who knows more about Europe can answer for you. Let's see. So Emma asks, what do you say about a situation where the language users are totally ignorant of the status of their language and the need for its documentation? That is a great question about awareness, right? I think a lot of people are not aware that language endangerment is a problem, that it's a phenomenon. Many people think, okay, my language is fine, it has always been fine. In fact, someone in the IASA community once said to me, you know, my grandparents spoke this language, their grandparents spoke this language, so what's going to change that people will stop speaking it? It's always been spoken, so it will always be spoken. And she wasn't really thinking about the fact that the world is changing, her community is changing. Everything about language in that town is changing. So just because somebody hasn't yet thought about language endangerment doesn't mean that they won't listen and understand if you start to explain it. It's always good to start that conversation and listen to what people have to say, and don't force them to care, but it never hurts to say, hey, languages can become endangered. Did you ever think about that? Heather asks, how many polysynthetic languages has my group worked on and how's it going? Let's see, the Language Documentation Training Center has worked on, Leah, you will have to correct me, I want to say more than 100 languages at this point. And I know some of them have been polysynthetic, although I do not remember which ones, so maybe Leah and Liv, you can chime in there. Circle of Indigenous Peoples, I'm sorry you couldn't leave any comments in the chat, so please do post in the group and I'll do my best to answer your questions there. Yes, I think that's all the questions for now. I will hang out another 5 minutes or so if anybody has questions, but thanks again to everybody who joined. I can't wait to see what you post. Yes, okay, LDTC has worked on 120 languages now, yay! That initiative has been going for 10 years or more than 10 years at the University of Hawaii. So that's, there was a huge diversity of languages they worked on, and you can check it out at the LDTC website, ldtc.org. Let's see, how did I first get started in this work and how did I learn IASA? I won't say that I learned IASA because I'm not a very good speaker. Nalapanzi tikili IASA, but I got started when I was in undergraduate in linguistics, and I took a field methods class with a speaker of Kinande, which is a language of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I thought, oh my gosh, Bantu languages are the greatest thing in the world, and I want to do this work, and I want to work with Bantu languages because they are beautiful. And so from there on, I took another class with a speaker of Majumba, which is another language of Cameroon. And I went to Cameroon for the first time with Ariane Gabu, the Majumba speaker, who now runs the Study Abroad program in Cameroon for Middlebury College. So if you are an undergraduate and you are interested in studying in Cameroon, check out the Middlebury program. Ariane is fantastic. She introduced me to Cameroon, and now it's my second home. Let's see, response to the myth that less languages equals more understanding and communication. Oh, that is such a good question. I want to say, think about civil wars. For example, the American Civil War, everybody spoke English. There was still a war. Think about, let's see, the genocide in Rwanda in the 90s. The people involved spoke the same language, but it was still horrible. But then think about multilingual and peaceful countries like, I don't know, Botswana or Switzerland or any other country that has good communication and understanding while also having lots of languages. There are plenty of real-world examples of how sharing a language does not guarantee peace or understanding, and having different languages does not guarantee conflict, right? There's also, Google Translate exists. It's 2019. We can all pretty much talk to each other regardless of language. Yes, Heather, great question. There is a huge gap in language attitudes between fluent and proficient speakers, or as of yet, non-speakers, and older people and youth. How do I address this in a respectful and open manner as a community member and language reclaimer or learner? Oh, that is such a good and complicated question. And actually, that is part of my dissertation research to a large degree, is the differences in attitudes between older people and younger people. And part of what I've found is that older people are much more pessimistic in the community where I work. They are much more concerned about the language and the changes to it and the changes in its use, whereas younger people think there's no problem for the most part. They think the language is not changing, it is not endangered, and even if it is, it doesn't matter. And middle-aged people are kind of in the middle. And that's a really tough thing to address, whether you are a community member yourself or an outside linguist. Because you can't say, hey, old people, start thinking like the young people. And you can't say, hey, young people, start thinking like the old people. The only place to start is listening to as many people as you can to get an understanding of the different sides of the story and the different perspectives. And then one thing that has worked pretty well so far in the IASA community. Oh, I wish Sammy were here. Sammy, are you in the chat? No. So my colleague Sammy Mbipite and I are working on a project to connect young people and old people to do language documentation. So we have trained a group of young people in their teens through 30s to do basic language documentation of older people's knowledge and language use. So they take the recorder to their grandparents' house or their older neighbor, whatever, and they talk together about language, and they sort of dialogue about the changes in the language and the use of the language and learn from each other. The goal is to have it be a two-way street where there is a restored connection between generations, and sort of a flow of information and thoughts between the generations. And it's pretty tough. And I don't know how it will go in the long run. We just started this last year, but so far it does seem like younger folks are now more aware of language endangerment and changes in the language. And older folks are more sympathetic to young people's motivations for having different language behavior. So the best advice I can give is listen a lot, and then maybe start a conversation between different groups of speakers if you can, if it's not a very fraught and dangerous and complicated topic to bring up. But you know your community best, and you'll have to trust your gut on that. What works in one place will not always work in another place. And that's not a very satisfying answer, but it's the honest answer, I guess. Okay, if there are not any more questions, or if you have questions later, you can always post them in the Facebook group, and I will answer them, or somebody else who knows better can answer them. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to see you next week at the webinar, where Peter Schulke from the University of Hawaii will be talking about phonology and orthography. So he'll be talking about the sounds of your language and how to write them down, or whether you should even write them down. So I will see y'all next week. Peter will be leading the workshop. It will be a great time, and post your thoughts and questions. Thanks, everybody. Bye.